It's first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's an absolute pleasure to be surrounded by, I believe, the real nuts and bolts of Indian sport, the coaches, the support staff, the mentors, and what GoSports have gone forward and achieved over the last few years is quite remarkable. I've been in India for 11 years. Some people may know me through cricket and various other things, but cricket has been my love, obviously, but I'm trying to find ways now to take that love into other sports in India as well and trying to inculcate a different mindset from the ground up. I believe I've got the best job in the world. I get to travel the world and practice my profession in sports physio and sports medicine, but at the same time, educate people at the same time, and I think that's where my role is now moving forward, is more in education in India. I'm one of these people that I read the back pages of the newspaper first. There's a great saying from the 60s that man's achievements are on the back pages and man's failures are often on the front pages, so I always tend to start at the back. My first message is that, I want people to understand that most educators feel that learning starts from the shoulders up, and I think as sports physios, sports scientists, we need to look at the learning from the shoulders down. I think that's really, really important, because that's how we achieve athletes at a younger age. We know that the physical capabilities of a child are developed the earlier we can get onto them. And so I think we need to start looking closer at children and start educating them about physical health and physical literacy from a much younger age. We talk about, in my profession, vitamin D and all of the various vitamins, but I think the most important vitamin at the moment that we're all talking about is vitamin M for movement. That's an area that we're really focusing on with children, trying to introduce earlier movement patterns with children, trying to introduce strategies for kids to be mobile earlier in their lives, trying to increase active free play, because this is where it all starts. This is where you achieve, this is where you build athletes. You don't build athletes from 15, 16 in their adolescence, you build athletes at the younger you can get them. So introducing movement at an earlier age in children is vital. Introducing physical education curriculums into schools is vital. This is where we breed athletes, and this is why Australia and countries like that are more successful at breeding athletes, is because we have that mindset inculcated at a much, much earlier age. The next generation of athletes comes from those children, and we've talked about that in some of these panel discussions. It's extremely difficult to make an athlete later on in life, and that's not just from a mindset perspective, but from a physical perspective and a physiological perspective as well, and that's the area that we're really looking at. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Little Athletics program we have in Australia. It's an initiative that's been around for a couple of generations now, but what it is bringing children or athletic programs to children at a very early age in the junior and primary school years. And what it does is it develops them the basic athletic skills to then take forward and develop other sports. So your basic skills of hopping, jumping, leapfrog, sprinting, just the basic movement pattern skills that all athletes need. And what it does is allows them to develop physically at an early age. But what it also does, it also gives them the groundwork, the framework to go and participate and succeed in all other sports as well. Interestingly, the brand ambassadors for Little Athletics in Australia are not athletes per se, like sprinters or high jumpers. They're actually from many other sports. Formula One, Mark Webber, there's a surfer, I think Leighton Hewitt was an ambassador as well. So they all attributed the Little Athletics program in Australia to giving them the basics to take them to the next level in their chosen sport. And I think that's an area that we really need to look at in India as well. I've been here 11 years in India, and it's interesting because my profession has changed a lot over those 11 years, my profession in sports physio, sports medicine. When I first came into India, we were talking about tendinitises. We've now changed that to tendinopathies. We're talking about exercising differently for various physical conditions. We talked about the role of stretching with athletes, and that's changed significantly over the last couple of years as well. We talked about Again, fasciitis, and now we've changed terminologies to fasciopathies. The reason why these terminologies have changed is because we've explored them more. We understand more about injury and injury management. And the more we understand, the more we open to new ideas, the more we're better able to treat these phenomena. Also, the other thing is technology. When I first started physio, and often when I still walk into physio practices here, I'll still see a shortwave diathermy machine, I'll still see an ultrasound machine, I'll still see an interferential machine. They're pieces of equipment that I haven't used for 25 years. Because I believe that my profession has evolved to the point where we don't necessarily need to rely on equipment anymore. Our skills are developed to the point where we can utilize our hands better than any piece of equipment. We still look at equipment and technology, though, to advance our sport and advance all our sports. And this is where we all need to have an open mind. Things started to change for me in cricket, and the way I look at cricket and the way we trained for cricket in the early mid-2000s. Around about 2003, I worked with a fellow from Australia called Justin Cordy, an outstanding physiologist, who, when we started GPS tracking cricketers, and the information that we started getting back, we always thought that cricket was a sport where most of the guys just stood around, they didn't do a lot, their average movement rates through the day's play were very low. And when the first data started coming out from GPS tracking, we were very surprised. We were seeing that in a 4-day match and in some test matches, the opening bowlers were moving anywhere between 20 and 25 kilometres in a day's play, in a single day's play. Similarly with the ODI, the figures were coming out around about 10 to 15 kilometres an opening bowler was travelling over the ground in a single day's play. So based on that, we suddenly realised that we were trained very poorly for cricket. We never looked at it as an endurance-based sport. We just looked at it short bursts of power. So now that completely changed the way that I looked at training for cricket. And so we need to embrace technology in some ways to enhance our knowledge of how to go forward with training. The new GPS trackers that are available, the Catapult Minimax, which is an amazing piece of equipment. It's a wearable technology which most of the elite players wear now. The difference about it is it's able to measure many parameters: acceleration, rotational forces, direction changes, etc., etc. So what that's allowed us is to get more and more information about our athletes, and then how better we can then intervene with those athletes. So one of the interesting things was the rate of perceived exertion of an athlete in a training session versus how they are in a match session or in a match situation. And most of them who perceived that they were working at 100% in a training or a match simulation were actually, according to the data coming back from the GPS, was they're really only working at about 75 to 80%. So they're probably 15 to 20% off match intensities. So then, interestingly for us, is that if we're looking at simulating intensities in training, we weren't achieving the result. So it also meant that returning from injury, we had to be very careful with returning players to the match situation because the intensities were not the same. So we're learning all the time about these things. The other one was also the average speeds during a simulated match situation or a training session. That the maximum speeds that we achieved were only around about 20 kilometres an hour, even though we thought we were training at our highest intensity. When we started looking at the data from the players who were in proper matches, international matches, it was around about 28 kilometres an hour on average. So so what that tells us, if we're returning a player, for example, with a hamstring or a calf injury back into a match situation, and there's a discrepancy of 20% between match and RPEs and match intensity, then we're in for a re-injury. So technology can be very, very useful if it's used in the right way. So that was interesting. The Cricket Australia's done some great work with because we can measure all these rotational forces and exertions, lateral flexion, rotation, etc. Cricketers are, if you ask a bowler, we log every ball that's ever bowled, and in training sessions especially. Now, if I ask a fast bowler to count his balls exactly per training session, they're not very good at it, and we start to get very poor data back from them. The thing about the new Catapult is that you can now through the actual machine itself can actually record exactly how many balls these guys are bowling. So we're now able to get significantly more reliable data, which we can then use in our loading and extrapolating that information to the players' programs. We've used imaging a lot more sensibly, I think. I often say to people, my best friend is the musculoskeletal radiologist. I think all sports physios will say the same thing. But imaging, especially the new use of ultrasound imaging and the advances we've got in MRI have really helped us along. With the fast bowlers in lumbar stress fractures, measuring things such as the size of the pars, the cross-sectional area of the pars we can now measure. We can also look at the proportion of trabecular bone versus cortical bone to see if players are more at risk or potential risk of injury as fast bowlers because of these deficiencies in their pars. So these are all things that we're looking at now and trying to predict injury as we move forward. One of my biggest things, which I've always had a problem with in all cricket, and probably a lot of you have in all sport, is how do we reduce load? How do we reduce load but maintain fitness parameters? The biggest killer for any athlete is load and overload. The biggest predictor of injury is load and overload. How can we get a lot smarter about that in all our sports? And there's one of the ways, well, what we need to do is start looking at other sports as well to get information. In cricket we certainly don't know everything, and we're now looking to other sports to try and get as much information as we can. On this load issue, we've looked at football and cycling as a couple of areas. One, football being, there's a phenomenal researcher, physiologist, and ex-player out of Denmark called Jens Bangsbo. His groundbreaking work on load, on training, and fatigue, muscle fatigue has been quite outstanding. We've looked to football to get answers for cricket. My biggest issue in cricket is load, but we've actually looked to football and guys like Jens Bangsbo and his work on the sodium pump for muscle fatigue research to help us with a big issue that we have in our sport. And I encourage everybody in other sports to use other or open their eyes to use other sports for information. We look at, surprisingly, in cricket, we look at the shoulder as being a big issue for us. Shoulder injuries is one of the biggest causes of loss of match time for us. So we've looked at baseball, obviously. Who has similar biomechanics to a cricket thrower and the cricket bowler biomechanically? It's baseball. And surprisingly, water polo. So there's been some great research out of Australia by Andrea Mosler and colleagues on monitoring water polo data, because the biomechanics of the water polo shoot, collect, throw, shoot, is very similar, and they have very similar problems. So, what we've learned from them on internal rotation deficits, what we've learned from them on internal rotation, external rotation, strength ratio deficits, has really helped us in cricket and has allowed us to be more sensible with the approach that we have for our athletes as well. So, we're looking at ways to predict injury, we're looking at ways to then treat injury, but we're also looking at ways to monitor players throughout seasons as well, and other sports have significantly helped us. Simulated altitude training, another one. We've looked to particularly cycling, the Tour de France guys. We've looked at tennis, Novak Djokovic, and his altitude training has taken those athletes to the next level physiologically. So it's a no-brainer for us to look at it as well, which we have, and with great results. 85% of all athletes at the last Olympics who won medals trained at altitude, so there's got to be something in it. So, we need to get a lot smarter about how we use technology and how we move forward in all our sports, and we're attempting to do that in cricket. We use blood markers, we use salivary markers for cortisol. Again, injury prediction. We know that elevated cortisol levels with stress, and that can be physical stress, it can be overtraining stress, it can be lack of sleep, it can be emotional relationship stress. We can see predictors in certain markers in our bloods, and so we're using that. We're trying to use that information. I know there are sports clubs in Australia that if a player's certain cortisol levels are not acceptable, even though he feels fine, he's not allowed to train that day, because we know with elevated cortisol levels your injury risk, muscle injury risk, is significantly higher. Diet's a big baby of mine, and I'm particularly vigorous on the diet debate, and I'm championing that more so in India, because I think we've got a big issue in India, not just with the general population, but with the sporting population as well. So diet for me has become something that I'm really passionate about. We've got to learn from guys like Professor Tim Noakes. We've got to learn from guys like Peter Bruckner. I don't know whether you know Peter Bruckner, clinical sports medicine fame, but probably one of the world's best sports scientists and sports medicine practitioners. We've got to learn from the likes of Stephen Finney, Jeff Volak, Westerman, these outstanding scientists who are really paving the way in the area of diet and nutrition in world sport and for the general population. We have to be open to these new ideas. We have to at least accept that there are new ideas out there, and we have to embrace them. And I know it's a very controversial topic with athletes and diet, but it is something that the new evidence out there is convincing enough for us to at least consider it. Sleep studies, we've looked at Australian rules football, we've looked at Australian rugby from the sleep studies that have been done by them, particularly out of Sports Medicine Australia. You know, outstanding results, you know, with changing sleep patterns and performance. You know, we know that if an athlete has less than 6 hours of sleep a night, their injury risk is much higher, their performance goes down. So something as simple as monitoring our players on overseas trips, you know, how they sleep, when they sleep, preparing for jet lag timings, etc., can make a huge influence on that player's performance and their injury rates. Injury data analysis is something that, you know, we use our own injury data analysis, but we're more and more looking at other sports for injury data analysis as well. And you've only got to look at the work out at the UEFA have done in European football with Jan Ekstrand and his colleagues over the last few years. And you know, they've got a pool of players of 22,000. You know, 22,000. That's a lot of data. And if we can find a way to use some of their football data, it's all out there, it's all open, it's on the open market. We can use it, we can access it, we must access it. And that's what we're starting to look at as well. You know, some of the injury stuff that they've got on ACL injuries, things that are really relevant to a lot of the athletes in this room and coaches in this room, you know, that's the stuff we need to be looking at. Big, large studies that have been done over long periods of time. Those UEFA studies have been around since 1994. So there's a huge bank of data that we've never accessed, but we must be open to accessing. And I think we need to be very open-minded on this topic as well. For example, we looked at ACL injury rates and some of the what we term successful outcomes of ACL repairs for the elite athlete. And if you look at most of the studies around at the moment, most of them say that around 40 to 50% return to their elite level post-ACL anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction. If you look at the UEFA data, it says something completely different. And we're now looking at their data because of the volumes that they have. You know, they're looking at 97% return rates to the elite level football post-ACL reconstruction. Now that is unbelievable. So we need to start, you know, being aware that there is new stuff out there and we need to access it. We can, from that data, we can now predict injury times. How long is a player going to be back after an injury? I can say to you now that, you know, after an ACL reconstruction in elite level football or equivalent sport is 7 months, give or take a very short time frame. So, you know, we can now be better equipped, certainly better equipped to answering the biggest question that every coach is going to ask a physio sports medicine practitioner is, how long is this athlete going to be out of play? I mean, that's the first question that I get. That's a lot of you guys would be asking me as coaches is, when can he play? Now, with this amount of data around, and they've been doing these return to sport studies over all injuries from ankle sprains to ACL reconstructions to everything, you know, we can now confidently say and give a more accurate time frame for the coach or the support staff, this is how long it's going to take. So, you know, we need to be open to this data and use it. But saying that, have we gone too far down the science path sometimes? And I think cricket is a classic example of that. I think we overtrain athletes. I think we overload athletes. And I think the injury rates that we're seeing in world cricket at the moment perhaps tell us that. The majority of injuries we're seeing in cricket are stress-related injuries, stress fractures, particularly around the lumbar spine and loading joints, the foot and lower limb. And we've got to ask questions as to why that is. We bring players into a system to protect them. But I think sometimes, and I've always said, and I want to do a talk on this one day, about, are we nurturing players or are we interfering with players? Do we actually believe that we should be giving them more and more and more when perhaps that's not what they necessarily need, especially the developing, skeletally developing athlete. So we need to be very aware that load, and this is why we're looking at some of these Jens Bangsbo studies about how can we train an athlete to improve their performance parameters, so cardiovascular measures, but without the excess loading. For example, and I'll go back to the Jens Bangsbo study, where he talked about they were in elite level footballers, they're reducing their training time, their cardiovascular training times by 50%, but increasing all their physical markers, so their 5 kilometre time trials, their sprint repeat tests, their yo-yo tests, their VO2 max tests. So all their parameters on a fitness front have improved despite reducing their load by 50%. Now that's all I want to hear. As a sports medicine and sports physio practitioner, that's what we want to hear. How can we offload our athletes but maintain their physical presence? As we use the hip range of movement tests, Nordic hamstring tests, lumbar extension, hip abduction adduction ratio tests, they all tell us something. They're all injury predictors in cricket. We know that if a fast bowler has less than 14 centimetres of ankle dorsiflexion on his opposite bowling foot, his injury risk is higher. We know that. But saying that, nothing is more important than history and taking a history from that athlete. That will tell you more about that athlete than any physical test ever will. And a classic example of that is some of the European football teams, where they've got 8 or 9 different nationalities in one team, and they're all coming together over a period of time. And in some of those cases, you might have an athlete there or footballer who's 30, 31, 32 years of age. He's been playing for 9 years consistently, or 10 years consistently at the highest level, never had an injury, but his musculoskeletal screening scores are terrible. Like, you would want to intervene. There's imbalances here, but his body has adapted to that. Now, as a young novice physio or moving into that arena, saw those screening data, said we have to fix that. And I've always said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If an injury arises, then we intervene, or you feel that there's something that needs monitoring, we monitor it. That's fine. But I think we intervene too much with some of these athletes and believe that we need to change something that they've already adapted to. So that is another word of warning for a lot of the young physios and young practitioners who are in the sports. So remember, history is probably the most important thing when we're looking at athletes. So that's where the role of data, collecting data becomes so important. And then we can also predict the possibility of injuries going forward. How has my profession changed? The biggest thing has been the introduction of money, and we've talked about that here. Perhaps not in all sports, but definitely in the sport that I've been involved with, and the level that I've been involved with is the introduction of huge amounts of money. And what the ramifications of that on the player we've heard about, but the ramifications of that on the athlete, on the support staff is also worth investigating, because with that more money becomes more responsibility. And I think Shane will touch it in that last one where he said, we've got players in our squad who are on $2 million plus for 6 weeks work. They need a very high level of support. And I think from my knowledge of cricket in this country, there's a big drop-off of financial support for a lot of these players as they move into the lesser and the association levels. And this topic of financial reward and incentivisation has come up consistently today, and I don't think we can ignore it, because at the end of the day, they're the people that we want to keep in the system. And if we have to keep them in the system by paying them more, then so be it. But there's a bit of a brain drain at the moment of guys leaving the system, going to Australia, going to the US. We've heard about it, going outside, and we must stop that. And I think if it means incentivising and increasing financial reward, then that has to be done. We look at all our players as assets, again, because we pay them so much. Like any company, if you have an asset, you've got to protect that asset. I travel all year round monitoring our assets, international tournaments. That's part of my responsibility. That's part of our responsibility to the player. And again, that is something that is a role that we've taken on, certainly at Rajasthan, that we feel that player come April 1 of the playing year, if he's not ready, then it's my responsibility. So, That's something that has changed for me over the last few years, is that constant contact with the player throughout the year. And I think that's crucial for establishing relationships with that player as well. What can we do to get better? What can we as sports physicians, sports physios, what can we do to be better at what we do? More open-minded for starters. I think we're too insular, and I'll be perfectly honest with you. I think the sports medicine, sports physio profession, this country is too insular. I think we feel and this topic has come up again today numerous times. I think we feel we know everything, and we're not. I don't know everything. I go to a lot of other people. I surround myself with people who know more than me because I want to know more. And that's the mindset we all have to have as practitioners, as coaches, as administrators. Be humble and be open to change, because there has to be change. My profession is an evolving profession. It changes weekly almost with the research and that's coming in. We have to evolve with it, because it's not in our best interest only, it's in the best interest of your athlete that you're managing. And if you don't evolve with it, you're only as good, you can look at it as you're only as good as the results that your athlete gets. But if you're giving the athlete poor inputs, then they're not going to get the results. And the better input you have, the better they're going to be overall. So be humble, share information, be open, share, be out there. But also align yourself to a really good information network. That's probably the key. And like I said, my best friend is a musculoskeletal radiologist, because I get so much information for him early on diagnosis. That helps me so much better, because I can then transfer that diagnosis immediately to the player, and intervention can start so much earlier. That's what it's about. It's not about us. It's about what is best ultimately for the athlete. Compassion, and that's come up a few times as well. You need to be compassionate. You can't have the starstruck syndrome. That's a big issue. But you need to be compassionate to the individual, because the greater relationship you have with them, and I've been lucky because I've travelled with teams where you're virtually living with the athlete, the cricketer, for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So you form relationships. And when you form relationships, the confidence goes up, and they will impart information to you that otherwise may not come. And that's crucial. And that's the information that may be the difference between diagnosing something or not diagnosing something. That could be the information. You'll be surprised what comes out on a physio couch. What information they tell you, relationship issues, which suddenly they're not performing, but you'll find out on the physio couch through that communication that that athlete or that player is having an issue at home with a relationship, etc. So these are crucial parts of understanding the athlete, and as physios, you are the first contact point for most of them. So that's something in our profession that we need to be wholly aware of, and we need to be open to communicating that effectively through to the coaching staff as well. There are ethical boundaries here that sometimes you can't cross, but finding a way to get that message back to the coaching staff. So communication is the key at all levels of travelling with teams. But ultimately, it's about skill. It's about how good you are at what you do. And again, upskilling is something that we all need to be doing consistently in all our professions, not just in the medical side of the support staff. And it is fantastic, I must say, to see the SMA connection. So Sports Medicine Australia, South Australian branch is here in the room today, and it is wonderful to see that, because there's a representative here from from the best sports medicine associations in the world, because they believe that they've got something to offer to India as well. And I think we should embrace this, because they are willing to come here and try and upskill at the support staff level. And I think that's an amazing thing. We've got to take our profession to the next level, but we've got to be open to it. They're open, we've got to embrace it. So I think it's a wonderful thing that the initiative that Daniel's taken to be here today. So all of us, it's about expanding our skills. For me, it's about, learning new concepts, Mulligan concepts, dry needling concepts, trigger points, manual therapy, muscle energies, taping, everything. It's changing all the time. I have to keep up with that. You have to keep up with it. And like I said before, we've got to collect data. We've got to collect as much data as we can about our sport, and get it to the right people to make the right analysis of how we better our professions and better our results for our athletes. The anti-doping debate is something that you're all familiar with. You've heard about it. You've lived it probably. but it's something that I have to deal with every day. We need to be educators, we need to be updated, it's an evolving topic as well. But I think education is our responsibility, but I also think we need to ask the question, why do athletes turn to drugs in the first place? Yes, it is for injury, for recovery, performance, a number of things, but I think one of the aspects is expectation, and unrealistic expectations, and that topic has been raised here today as well. And I think, is Shada still here? But sometimes I do blame the media a little about expectation on young athletes. And some people say they go off to the Olympics and all you read in the paper is they came back with a bronze medal, or they didn't come back with a medal, they came 8th. My God, it is so hard to even get to the Olympics, to qualify for the Olympics. That is success in itself, and that should be embraced and applauded. We shouldn't focus on the fact that they didn't necessarily get a medal at the Olympics. We should be embracing the fact that they actually made it to the Olympics. And I think the media needs to change their outlook and overall perception of athletic success in this country for things like the anti-doping and drug issue in this country to be resolved. So I think it's a multi-layered issue, but I think that's probably something that we need to look at. Success, people look at success in a number of different ways. I remember the 2013 Champions League final in Delhi, where we played Mumbai and lost in a very high-scoring but very good game. And we came off the field. It was Rahul Dravid, your local boy, wonderful fellow. It was his last game as captain, and we went into the dressing room. And he got us all together, and he was beaming, and we're all a bit distraught. And some of the young boys were really upset because they'd lost. And he stood up and he got us all together and he said, "I'd rather be in this dressing room having lost than in that dressing room having won." And it was because he felt the development that he'd seen in these young boys, what they'd achieved, what they'd learnt on the way, who they'd interacted with, they were all the little successes that he was talking about. And when we sat back and looked about it, it's not always about silverware, it's not always about the trophy in the cabinet. It's what you learn, it's experiences you take from that. Through that campaign, we developed Sanju Samson, Stuart Binney, all these young boys that came through that system. That is success. And there was a very personal story that Rahul told. I won't say it today, but he told a very personal story about his success in that tournament relating to his father, which was a wonderful story. So everybody took away from that tournament a success. It wasn't the trophy, but that didn't matter. And I think that's what we need to be more focused on in Indian sport. The other thing I learned along the way is, taking responsibility and creating a mindset of accountability, and we've talked about that as well, but also about initiative. Good teams have responsibility and initiative, but how do they get it? And I think certainly at Rajasthan Royals, we always kept a very small management group, and one of the reasons for that was we only had, I think, 5 in our management group. A player, coach, which was Rahul, we had a technical guy, we had myself, Paddy Upton as a mental conditioning coach, and an analyst. That was it. And whereas some of them had 14, 15 in their support staff. But what that breeds is it breeds a mindset of going back to your players and going back to your colleagues and peers for information. If you need it, it's in that group. And we believed we had enough years of experience of cricket in that group to encourage the young boys to go back and ask those questions to not only the coaches, but also to the playing group themselves. And that is that was a huge way of giving those young boys a level of confidence, that they could approach a Shane Watson or a Rahul Dravid or a Stephen Smith and get an answer from them, not having to go via a number of coaches. So I think that that is something that we've learned along the way as well. The other thing that when I first came to India, I never felt that players, even though they perceived themselves to be working at 100%. They were probably never really out of third gear. They were probably only at about 75% on the physical or mental scale that we worked on. And it was really interesting in 2008 when we won the first IPO when Shane Warne was captain. One of the things two things he talked about. One was find a way, which was one of his mantras, and the other one was just go to the edge. And what he talked about was unless you go to the edge, you'll never know where your limits are at any level, psychologically, physically, technically, whatever. And he always said, never be afraid to go to the edge, because if you fall off, then you know where that cliff face is. Then you know where the edge is. Never be afraid to find that cliff face, because he said in good teams, if you fall off the edge, your teammates are there to catch you. And that, that certainly was a turning point for us in first year when he talked about that. So I believe that if you have a really good team around you, you will be willing to take yourself further and further to push those boundaries, because you know you've got the support of your teammates around you and a good team structure around you. So again, we've all talked about team structure and support networks, but to put that into practice is a really, really hard thing. And I think coming from Shane Warne at that period of time in our campaign, was exactly what the boys needed. And it's true. So always explore your limits in all of our professions. I'm not talking just about the athlete. I'm talking about it for all of us. Always be there to explore. You must be exploring your limits consistently. Another question I'm often asked is, why do Australians win all the time? Why do we perform at sports across the board, not just in one or two sports? Why is it consistently that we have this mindset of win, win, win? And I think it comes down to a couple of things. One of them is we play a lot of contact sports. So I think it's durability is the word that I use. But we play a lot of contact sports as children, as very small children. Rugby league, I don't know whether you've seen Australian rules football, but it's a seriously tough sport. And we play those from a very, very young age. So inbuilt into us is a certain amount of durability, a toughness, which then physical toughness we know carries over into the mental sphere as well. But coming to India 11 years ago, and before that I had 4 years in Bangladesh as well, so I've had 15 years in the subcontinent. It wasn't that noticeable. And the thing that really worried me, and if you're trying to breed tough athletes, this is a real worry, or durable athletes, is that when a child here falls over, the first response, even though the child hasn't started crying or is not in any visible distress, the first response is to smother that child with affection. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think it's a wonderful cultural expression. But I think if you're trying to breed tough athletes, you must let that child fall over. We all know as parents when a child is actually hurt, because I see this on the cricket field. So what happens is a child will fall over, they'll quite happily get up, but then everybody smothers around them. Oh, you poor thing, it must hurt. This is oh dear, oh, there's some blood, oh dear. And suddenly the child then starts crying. So they feel, oh dear, it must be a big issue. Now that happens in the sporting field. When that happens in the sporting field, that's not such a good thing, because then they take that mindset further and further into their sporting lives. And I've seen it so many times in international cricket where one of the young boys will be on the field. It'll be a crucial part of the match. One day international, T20, he'll dive, he'll get a little bit of scrape on his arm, there'll be a bit of blood, and he'll want to come off the field. Now if he comes off the field, he's broken a big chain of, sequences of play, etc., etc. And it disrupts the whole play. How often does a guy go off, 12th man comes on, a catch is dropped, something happens? So I think breeding tough athletes has to come from the system that we develop in their junior years, and that's why I'm heavily involved in a few projects that are involved in getting kids involved in sports at a significantly younger age, because that's where we breed toughness. And as parents, we need to be a little bit more aware that it's okay to take a bit of a tough and a rumble and actually have some cuts and scrapes, because that's the real world. That's the preparation for the real sporting world. If you're going to fall over and want to come off the field every time you have a bit of a scrape or a cut on your arm, this is what I'm saying with breeding durability. It's not going to happen. Always look for a role model. Always look to the next generation. I'm constantly looking to the next generation. I'm trying to help and upskill, because I'm not here forever. None of us are all here forever. And we've talked about this in numerous panel discussions. We've all got to make efforts to breed that next generation of athletes, of coaches, of support staff. So, I think that is something that, the educators of the next generation, that's how we are. We must embrace that role as well. And again, like I said, let's get kids more involved in sport, and that's our way of producing the next generation of athletes. I'll finish by saying, there's an old saying, learn by standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, if I've seen further, it is only by standing on the shoulders of giants. And, you know, I've got to a certain point in my profession because I've been able to do that. I've learned from others. I've stood on other people's shoulders and had a good look. I want people to start standing on my shoulders, on your shoulders, and start looking around as well, because in India at the moment, I don't think we do enough of that. I don't think we use our networks. I don't think we use the people who have knowledge, and I think we need to start exploiting them, if that's the right word, a little better, because there is enormous knowledge out there, and we just need to find ways to tap into it, to harness it, and move forward. I think what we've discussed through all these discussions today, you know, there's been some really key points, and I'm really happy to see that we've actually been logging all this information as we've gone through the day, because this is the start of something really big, I believe, from the coaching and the support and administrative staff perspective, that we're building. This is data. This is what I'm talking about. We're building data, we're building information, and that's what we're all here to do. Impart the information, be open with it. Let's build on it, let's get it together, but let's make some sense of it as well. And if we do that, I think India is going to move towards the next generation of athletes with a really exciting future. So thanks again very much for having me here, and I look forward to the panel discussion.